The strangest letter I ever received arrived 20 years too late. It was a rainy Tuesday morning when I found the envelope waiting in my mailbox. At first glance, it looked ordinary. Cream-colored paper. A typed address. No return label. Nothing about it suggested that opening it would force me to question everything I had believed for most of my life. My name is Sophia Hayes. I am 32 years old, and for the last 2 decades, I have lived with a story that never changed. At least, that is what I thought. According to the version I grew up believing, I had been abandoned by the only family I ever knew. I was 12 years old when I disappeared from their lives. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say they disappeared from mine. Either way, the result was the same. No birthday cards. No phone calls. No invitations. No explanations. Just silence. Over time, silence becomes its own kind of answer. At least that is what I told myself. I carried that answer through high school, through college, through every apartment I rented, and every job I worked. Whenever people asked about my family, I gave short responses and changed the subject. It was easier than explaining. Easier than admitting that somewhere in this world existed people who shared my blood, but not my life. For years, I convinced myself I did not care. Then the letter arrived. I stood in my small kitchen holding the envelope while rain tapped softly against the windows. Part of me wanted to throw it away unopened. Another part needed to know. Curiosity has a way of surviving even when hope does not. I carefully unfolded the single sheet inside. The message was brief. A funeral service would be held that Saturday in Cedar Falls. The deceased was Eleanor Hayes, my grandmother. For several seconds, I simply stared at the page. Eleanor Hayes. The name felt strange and familiar at the same time. I had not spoken it aloud in years. Growing up, she had been one of the few people who made me feel safe. She baked apple pies on Sunday afternoons. She kept old photographs in wooden boxes. She always smelled faintly of lavender and cinnamon. Then one day she was gone, along with everyone else. The funeral notice contained only a few additional details. Time, location, contact information for a law office handling family matters. No personal message. No explanation for why I had been informed after 2 decades of silence. I sat down at the kitchen table and read the letter again. Then again. By the 4th time, I noticed something unusual. Attached to the bottom was a handwritten note in faded blue ink. The writing was shaky, as though produced by an elderly hand. It contained only 6 words. There is something you deserve to know. No signature. No explanation. Just those words. I felt my heartbeat quicken. For 20 years, I believed the story was simple. I had been abandoned. They had moved on. End of story. Yet something about that note suggested otherwise. Over the next several days, I could think of little else. At work, I found myself staring out windows instead of concentrating on reports. At night, I lay awake replaying old memories I had spent years trying to forget. By Friday evening, I had made my decision. Early Saturday morning, I packed a small overnight bag and started the 3-hour drive to Cedar Falls. The highway stretched ahead beneath gray autumn skies. Mile after mile passed beneath my tires while questions crowded my thoughts. Why had someone contacted me now? Why after 20 years? And most importantly, what was it that I supposedly deserved to know? As the town where my past still waited slowly appeared on the horizon, I realized something I had not felt in a very long time. Fear. Not fear of seeing my family again. Fear that the story I had carried for 20 years might not be the truth after all. 6 minutes before the funeral service began, I parked across the street from St. Andrew's Church and sat motionless behind the steering wheel. The building looked exactly the way I remembered. White brick walls, tall stained glass windows, a bell tower that rose above the surrounding trees. Time had weathered the structure, but somehow it still carried the same quiet presence it had when I was a child. My hands rested on the steering wheel while people slowly gathered near the entrance. Some faces were unfamiliar. Others stirred. Distant memories I could not fully place. For a moment, I considered turning around. Nobody knew I was coming. Nobody expected me. I could leave and never return. The thought lasted only a few seconds. Then I looked at the folded funeral notice resting on the passenger seat. There is something you deserve to know. Those words had followed me throughout the entire drive. They had become impossible to ignore. I stepped out of the car and crossed the street. The cool autumn air carried the scent of damp leaves and freshly cut grass. As I approached the church, a strange feeling settled over me. It was not grief. Not yet. It felt more like standing at the edge of a door that had been closed for 20 years. Inside the church, soft organ music drifted through the sanctuary. Rows of wooden pews stretched toward the altar. White flowers surrounded a framed photograph of Eleanor Hayes. Seeing her face again after so many years stopped me in my tracks. She looked older than I remembered, of course. The photograph had been taken recently, yet her smile remained the same. Warm, gentle, familiar. I felt an unexpected ache in my chest. For years, I told myself I no longer cared. Looking at that photograph, I realized how much of that had been a lie. I quietly took a seat in the last row. Most people were too focused on the service to notice me. That was fine. I preferred it that way. From the back of the church, I studied the family I had not seen in 2 decades. My uncle Michael sat near the front beside his wife Rebecca. Both looked older. Michael's hair had turned almost completely gray. Rebecca wore a dark blue dress and stared silently at the floor. Several cousins occupied nearby pews. Some I recognized immediately. Others had changed so much that I struggled to identify them. Then I noticed something unexpected. They looked uncomfortable. Not sad. Not merely grieving. Uneasy. As though everyone was carrying a burden nobody wanted to discuss. The service began. The pastor spoke about Eleanor's kindness, generosity, and devotion to family. Several relatives shared memories. People laughed softly at old stories. Others wiped tears from their eyes. I listened carefully, waiting for anger to appear inside me. It never did. Instead, I felt something far more confusing. Questions. Why had nobody contacted me when she was alive? Why now? Why send that note? About halfway through the service, a woman seated several rows ahead turned around. Her eyes widened the moment she saw me. For a second, she looked as though she had seen a ghost. Then she quickly faced forward again. The reaction did not go unnoticed. Within minutes, whispers began moving quietly through nearby pews. Heads turned. Expressions changed. Curiosity spread from person to person. One cousin glanced at me twice before nudging another relative. Suddenly, I was no longer invisible. By the time the service ended, several members of the family had recognized me. Yet nobody approached. Nobody spoke. They simply stared. As mourners slowly filed toward the exit, I remained seated in the back row. Part of me expected someone to demand an explanation for my presence. Instead, an unfamiliar man in a dark suit approached quietly. He appeared to be in his 60s. Professional, calm, deliberate. He stopped beside my pew and extended his hand. "Sophia Hayes?" he asked. I nodded cautiously. He reached into his briefcase and removed a small wooden box no larger than a hardcover book. "My name is James Holloway," he said. "Your grandmother instructed me to give this to you personally after today's service." My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the box without touching it. Then I noticed something engraved into the wood. 3 words. "For Sophia alone." And in that moment, I realized the funeral was not the reason I had been called back. It was only the beginning. For several moments after the church emptied, I remained seated with the wooden box resting on my lap. The sanctuary had grown quiet. The organ music was gone. The mourners had moved outside toward the cemetery and reception hall. Yet I could not bring myself to stand. My eyes remained fixed on the words engraved into the lid. For Sophia alone. 20 years of silence suddenly felt heavier than ever. Attorney James Holloway waited patiently nearby. He did not seem surprised by my hesitation. In fact, he looked like a man who had witnessed this exact reaction before. "Your grandmother was very specific," he finally said. "She wanted you to receive that personally." I looked up. Did she know I would come? A faint smile crossed his face. "She hoped you would." Hope. The word struck me harder than I expected. Hope was not something I associated with my family anymore. I carefully stood and followed James outside. The cemetery sat behind the church beneath tall oak trees whose leaves had begun turning shades of gold and amber. Small groups of relatives gathered near the gravesite. Conversations stopped as I approached. Some people stared openly. Others avoided eye contact altogether. The years had changed everyone, but the tension remained strangely familiar. Nobody seemed to know whether to welcome me or fear what my presence meant. I chose to keep walking. After the burial service ended, guests gradually drifted toward a nearby reception hall. I considered leaving. The box was already more than I had expected to receive. Yet something inside me resisted the idea of driving away without answers. Before I could make a decision, a voice called my name. "Sophia?" I turned. My Uncle Michael stood a few feet away. Time had aged him considerably. The confident man I remembered from childhood seemed smaller somehow, less certain. He looked at me for several seconds before speaking again. I did not know if you would come. His words sounded honest. Unfortunately, honesty was not enough. Neither did I replied. An awkward silence followed. For a moment, it seemed as though he wanted to say something important. Instead, he glanced toward the wooden box in my hands. The change in his expression was immediate. Concern, maybe even worry. Where did you get that? He asked. I noticed how quickly the question came. Too quickly. The attorney gave it to me. Michael's jaw tightened. It lasted only a second, but I saw it. Then he forced a smile. I see. Before either of us could continue, Rebecca appeared beside him. She greeted me politely, but looked equally unsettled by the box. Suddenly, I felt as though I was holding something far more important than old family keepsakes. The reaction was impossible to ignore. Throughout the reception, I noticed similar expressions from several relatives. Curious glances, nervous whispers, quiet conversations that stopped whenever I approached. Nobody asked what was inside, yet everyone seemed deeply interested in whether I had opened it. That alone told me something. Eventually, I found a quiet corner table away from the crowd. The wooden box sat unopened beside my coffee cup. Across the room, family members moved through conversations and memories while I studied them. 20 years ago, I believed these people had erased me from their lives without hesitation. Today, for the first time, I began wondering whether there was more to the story. Too many reactions felt wrong. Too many people looked afraid. Late in the afternoon, Attorney James approached my table once again. He sat down across from me and lowered his voice. There is something you should know. My pulse quickened. What? He glanced briefly toward the rest of the family before answering. Your grandmother spent years trying to make sure that box reached you. The room suddenly felt quieter. Why? I asked. James studied me carefully. Because she believed the truth was buried inside it. I stared at him. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. Then my eyes drifted back to the wooden box. 20 years of silence. 20 years of unanswered questions. 20 years of believing I had been abandoned. And somehow, I knew that before this day ended, I was finally going to open the one thing my family seemed most afraid for me to see. I did not open the box at the reception hall. Whatever waited inside had already survived 20 years. It could survive another hour. By early evening, I checked into a small motel on the edge of Cedar Falls. The building was older than most of the chain hotels along the interstate, but it was clean, quiet, and far enough away from my family to let me think. The wooden box sat on the passenger seat during the drive, and I found myself glancing at it every few minutes. Questions followed me the entire way. Why had my grandmother protected it so carefully? Why had so many relatives reacted the moment they saw it? Most importantly, what truth could possibly remain hidden after 2 decades? Inside my room, I placed the box on a small round table near the window. The sun was setting beyond the parking lot, casting long shadows across the carpet. For several minutes, I simply stared at it. Then I finally reached forward and lifted the lid. The first thing I noticed was a letter resting on top. The envelope was yellowed with age. Written across the front in elegant handwriting were 2 words. My Sophia. My throat tightened instantly. I recognized the handwriting. Eleanor's. With trembling fingers, I unfolded the letter. The paper felt fragile. The ink had faded slightly over the years. I began reading. My dearest Sophia, if you are reading this, then I am no longer here to tell you these things myself. First, I need you to know that I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day. Tears blurred my vision before I reached the next sentence. I paused and took a breath. Then I continued. Eleanor wrote about birthdays she had missed, holidays she had spent thinking about me, and countless moments when she wanted to contact me, but could not. The words felt sincere. Painfully sincere. Nothing about the letter sounded like someone trying to excuse abandonment. It sounded like someone carrying regret. Then I reached a paragraph that made my heart stop. You were told a story about why you left this family. That story was not the truth. I read the sentence twice. Then a third time. Suddenly the room felt smaller. The silence around me seemed to grow louder. My entire life had been built upon a single belief. That belief was now being challenged by the one person I had trusted most as a child. I continued reading. Eleanor did not immediately explain what the truth was. Instead, she instructed me to examine the remaining contents of the box. Beneath the letter were several folders secured with faded ribbons. Old photographs, legal papers, copies of letters, newspaper clippings, documents dating back more than 20 years. The deeper I looked, the more confused I became. Some papers appeared to involve custody matters. Others contained correspondence between family members. Several pages included signatures I recognized. One name appeared repeatedly. Michael Hayes. My uncle. The same uncle who had looked so nervous when he saw the box earlier that day. I carefully organized the documents across the table. Piece by piece, a picture began forming. Not a complete picture. Not yet. But enough to make me question everything. One document especially caught my attention. It appeared to be a letter written by Eleanor to an attorney many years ago. Certain sections had been highlighted. One sentence stood out immediately. Sophia must never learn who made this decision until the full truth can be proven. I stared at those words for a long time. Made what decision? Proven what truth? My pulse quickened. Somewhere inside this collection of papers was the answer. Somewhere in these documents existed the reason my life had changed 20 years ago. The reason I lost my family. The reason nobody ever came looking for me. Outside, darkness settled across the parking lot. Inside the motel room, papers covered nearly every available surface. And as I examined one document after another, I realized something that terrified me far more than abandonment ever had. The people I blamed for 20 years might not be the people responsible at all. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, fragments of the documents drifted through my mind. Names, dates, signatures, questions. By sunrise, the motel room looked less like a place to rest and more like an investigation board. Papers covered the table, the desk, and part of the bed. Coffee sat untouched beside a stack of folders while I studied the same pages again and again, searching for something I might have missed. The more I read, the more one fact became impossible to ignore. The story I had believed for 20 years contained gaps. Large ones. Details that never made sense now stood out clearly. Why had nobody from the family ever contacted me directly? Why had official records seemed so difficult to obtain whenever I tried asking questions as a teenager? Why had certain conversations always ended the moment I pushed for answers? At the time, I assumed those things happened because people wanted to forget me. Now I was not so sure. Around 9 o'clock that morning, I found a sealed envelope tucked beneath one of the folders. It had been hidden between several legal documents. Across the front was a handwritten date from 20 years earlier. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a copy of a letter sent by Eleanor to an attorney. Unlike the personal letter I had read the night before, this one was formal and direct. Several sections immediately caught my attention. Eleanor repeatedly expressed concern about decisions being made on my behalf without her consent. She referenced disagreements within the family. She mentioned pressure. She mentioned fear. Most importantly, she referred to a meeting that took place shortly before I disappeared from the family's life. A meeting involving Michael. I read the letter twice, then a third time. Each reading left me more unsettled than the last. According to everything I had been told, the separation happened because nobody wanted me anymore. That had always been the explanation, spoken directly or implied through silence. Yet the documents suggested something entirely different. They suggested there had been conflict, arguments, decisions made behind closed doors, the possibility that not everyone agreed with what happened. My phone suddenly rang, startling me. The caller identification displayed an unfamiliar number. After a brief hesitation, I answered. Sophia? The voice belonged to attorney James Holloway. There is something you should see, he said. Less than an hour later, I met him at his office near downtown Cedar Falls. The building was modest but professional. Bookshelves lined the walls. Framed certificates hung neatly behind his desk. James seemed more serious than he had at the funeral. He closed the office door before speaking. Your grandmother left instructions regarding those documents, he said. She anticipated that certain questions would arise. I nodded. I already have questions. Good, he replied quietly. You should. He opened a file drawer and removed another folder. Unlike the papers from the box, these appeared newer, more organized, more complete. He slid one document across the desk toward me. It contained records from years ago connected to family legal matters. I scanned the page. Then another. Then another. Slowly, a pattern began emerging. The same names appeared repeatedly. Michael Hayes. several advisors, administrative filings, correspondence, decisions, recommendations, entire conversations that had never included Eleanor or me. Why am I seeing this now? I asked. James folded his hands. Because your grandmother spent years gathering evidence. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Evidence of what? For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he chose his words carefully. Evidence that the events surrounding your departure may not have happened the way you were told. My heart pounded. It was the closest anyone had come to confirming my growing suspicions. Yet even now, the full truth remained hidden. James was not ready to reveal everything. The documents were not complete. The picture remained unfinished. But as I left his office that afternoon carrying copies of additional records, one thing had become clear. 20 years ago, someone shaped a story that changed the course of my life. And with every new piece of evidence, that story was beginning to fall apart. That evening, I returned to the motel carrying more questions than answers. The stack of documents from James Holloway's office sat beside me on the passenger seat like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. For 20 years, I believed my family had chosen to erase me. Now every new document suggested something more complicated, something deliberate, something hidden. Back in my room, I spread the papers across the table once again. Outside, a steady rain tapped against the window. Inside, the silence felt heavy. I focused on dates first. Dates do not lie. Emotions can be manipulated. Memories can fade. Stories can change. Dates remained stubbornly honest. The timeline that emerged shocked me. Several key decisions concerning my future had been made within a period of only 3 weeks. 3 weeks that changed everything. More disturbing was who appeared to be making those decisions. Again and again, I found Michael's name connected to meetings, correspondence, and recommendations. Yet one thing remained missing. Motive. Why would my uncle want me removed from the family? The answer appeared unexpectedly inside a folder I had almost ignored. Tucked between legal records was a handwritten journal page from Eleanor. The date matched the period immediately before my departure. I carefully began reading. At first, the entry seemed ordinary. Eleanor wrote about family disagreements and growing tension inside the household. Then I reached a passage that made my stomach tighten. Michael insists he is protecting the family's future. He believes Sophia's presence threatens everything we have built. I read the sentence again. Then again. Threatens everything we have built. The words made no sense. I was 12 years old. What threat could a child possibly represent? The next paragraph provided a clue, but not a complete answer. Eleanor referred to matters involving inheritance, family assets, and concerns that certain information might become public. She never explained further. Instead, she wrote something even more troubling. If the truth ever reaches Sophia, she will understand why I fought so hard to stop this. I lowered the page and stared into space. For years, I imagined Eleanor standing silently while my life unraveled. Now I was discovering evidence that she may have been fighting behind the scenes all along. The realization was almost painful. Around 8 o'clock, my phone rang. The caller identification displayed Michael Hayes. For several seconds, I simply stared at the screen. Then I answered. Hello. Silence greeted me at first. Then his voice appeared. Tired. Hesitant. Older than I remembered. Sophia, we need to talk. I leaned back slowly. About what? Another pause. About a lot of things. The conversation that followed felt strange. Michael never directly asked about the documents. Yet every question seemed designed to discover what I already knew. Had I spoken to James? Had I read everything? Was I planning to stay in town much longer? His concerns sounded less like family interest and more like anxiety. Eventually, I asked a question of my own. Why was everyone so worried about that box? The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Some things are better left in the past, he finally said. The answer sent a chill through me. Not because of what he said, because of what he did not say. After we ended the call, I sat quietly in the motel room replaying every word. The documents, Eleanor's letters, Michael's nervous behavior. The pieces were beginning to align. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to reveal the outline of something much larger than abandonment. Someone had made a decision 20 years ago. Someone had benefited from that decision. And someone had spent the next 2 decades making sure the real story remained hidden. Near midnight, I opened the final folder from James's office. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Attached to it was a handwritten note from Eleanor. The note contained only one sentence. James will explain the rest when the family is together. My pulse quickened immediately. The family together. Whatever remained hidden was apparently too important to reveal privately. It required witnesses. It required everyone present. And for the first time since returning to Cedar Falls, I realized the truth was no longer hiding in old documents. It was waiting for a confrontation. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon. Attorney James Holloway called shortly after sunrise and informed me that every available family member had agreed to attend. The gathering would take place in a private conference room at his office. No details had been shared. No explanations had been given. Yet somehow everyone seemed to understand that something important was about to happen. I spent the morning walking through Cedar Falls. The town felt smaller than I remembered. Streets that once seemed endless now ended after a few short blocks. Buildings looked familiar yet distant, like photographs from another life. As I passed the old library, the elementary school, and the small diner where my grandmother used to buy me pancakes on Saturday mornings, memories surfaced faster than I could stop them. Some were happy, others hurt. All of them belonged to a version of myself I thought had disappeared long ago. By early afternoon, I arrived at James's office. The conference room occupied the second floor of the building. Large windows overlooked downtown Cedar Falls. A polished table stretched through the center of the room. Water glasses sat neatly arranged at every seat. The atmosphere felt strangely formal, almost like a courtroom without a judge. James greeted me quietly and guided me inside. "Are you ready?" he asked. I considered the question carefully. The honest answer was no. I was not ready. Not for whatever truth waited behind 20 years of silence. Not for whatever explanation had been hidden from me. Yet I nodded anyway. Some answers arrive whether you are prepared or not. Family members began arriving shortly afterward. Michael entered first. The moment he saw me, tension appeared across his face. Rebecca followed close behind. Several cousins arrived next, exchanging uncertain glances with one another. Nobody seemed comfortable. Nobody seemed relaxed. The room filled with polite greetings and nervous conversation. Yet beneath the surface, everyone appeared to be waiting for the same thing. Eventually, the door opened one final time. The last relative took a seat. James closed the door behind him. The sound echoed through the room. Silence followed immediately. No one reached for water. No one checked a phone. Every eye turned toward the attorney. James remained standing at the front of the room. In his hands rested a thick file. I recognized it instantly. It contained the same records my grandmother had spent years collecting. The same documents that had already begun dismantling the story I believed for most of my life. "Thank you all for coming," James began. His voice was calm but firm. Eleanor Hayes left specific instructions regarding today's meeting. The mention of Eleanor immediately changed the room. Several relatives shifted in their seats. Michael looked down at the table. James continued. Before her passing, Eleanor spent many years documenting events connected to family decisions made approximately 20 years ago. Nobody spoke. The silence felt heavier with every passing second. Those records indicate that important information was withheld from multiple members of this family. I noticed several relatives exchange confused looks. Others appeared worried. Michael remained motionless. James opened the file and removed several documents. "The purpose of today's meeting is not accusation," he said. "The purpose is clarification." Clarification. Such a simple word. Yet it carried enough weight to make my pulse quicken. James distributed copies across the table. One by one, family members began reading. Reactions appeared almost immediately. Confusion, surprise, disbelief. A cousin quietly whispered something under her breath. Rebecca covered her mouth with one hand. Michael's face slowly lost color. For the first time since returning to Cedar Falls, I realized I was not the only person learning the truth. Many people in this room had been living inside the same false story. Then James removed one final envelope from the file. The paper looked older than everything else. More worn. More important. He placed it carefully on the table. "This," he said quietly, "is the document Eleanor believed would finally explain what happened." Every person in the room stared at the envelope. And for the first time in 20 years, I felt that the answer I had been searching for was finally within reach. No one spoke as James carefully opened the envelope. The sound of paper sliding free seemed impossibly loud in the silent room. Every person seated around the conference table watched him. Some looked confused. Others looked nervous. Michael looked as though he already knew what was coming. I could not take my eyes off the document in James's hands. 20 years of questions seemed concentrated into that single sheet of paper. James adjusted his glasses and began reading. The document was a signed statement prepared years earlier. It contained details surrounding the events that led to my departure from the family. At first, the language sounded formal and distant. Names, dates, meetings, recommendations. Then the story changed. Piece by piece, the truth emerged. 20 years ago, following the death of my parents, discussions began regarding my future care and guardianship. Eleanor wanted me to remain close to the family. She argued repeatedly that I belonged with relatives who knew and loved me. The records showed that she fought for that position over and over again. Yet she was not the only voice involved. Other family members believed something different. James continued reading. According to the statement, concerns had been raised about financial matters connected to a trust established by my parents before their deaths. A trust one never knew existed. The room immediately became still. Several relatives exchanged stunned looks. I felt my pulse pounding in my ears. The trust had been designed to support me until adulthood. It included educational funding and family assets intended solely for my future. I stared at the table, struggling to process what I was hearing. Nobody had ever mentioned a trust. Not once. Then came the revelation that changed everything. The records showed that certain individuals believed my continued presence would complicate access to those assets. Legal disputes followed. Private meetings took place. Recommendations were made. Eventually, a plan was presented that would remove me from direct family care and place me elsewhere under the justification that it was in my best interest. The words struck like a physical blow. Not because they were dramatic. Because they sounded so ordinary. So official. So calculated. Across the room, Rebecca lowered her eyes. Several cousins appeared visibly shaken. Then James read the name connected most frequently to those recommendations. Michael Hayes. The silence that followed felt endless. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Michael sat motionless in his chair. For the first time since I returned to Cedar Falls, he did not look nervous. He looked defeated. James continued. Additional records confirmed that Eleanor objected repeatedly. She wrote letters. She contacted attorneys. She challenged decisions. She warned that the truth would eventually surface. Yet despite her efforts, the process moved forward. By the time she secured legal assistance capable of reversing the outcome, years had already passed. The damage had been done. I felt as though the room had disappeared around me. 20 years. 20 years. Believing nobody wanted me. 20 years believing I had been forgotten. 20 years carrying resentment toward people who may never have abandoned me at all. Tears filled my eyes, but I forced myself to keep listening. Then James reached the final section. He unfolded another letter. This one was written entirely by Eleanor. Her words filled the room. She described her regret, her frustration, her determination to preserve evidence. Most importantly, she addressed me directly. Sophia, if you are hearing this, know that you were never unwanted. You were never forgotten. And you were never abandoned by the people who loved you. I closed my eyes. For a moment, I could not breathe. The sentence shattered something inside me. Not because it caused pain, because it ended 20 years of it. Across the table, Michael finally spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper. I thought I was protecting the family. Nobody responded. Nobody could. Because the truth had finally arrived. And the family that spent 2 decades living inside a carefully constructed story was now staring directly at what had really happened. The room remained silent long after Michael's words faded. Nobody seemed to know what to say. For 20 years, an entire family had lived beneath the weight of a false story. Some had believed it completely. Others had suspected pieces were missing. Yet none of us understood how much damage that story had caused until this moment. I sat quietly, staring at the documents spread across the conference table. The answers I had searched for since childhood were finally in front of me. Strangely, they did not bring the satisfaction I once imagined. They brought something else. Peace. Not complete peace. Not immediately, but the beginning of it. Michael looked older than he had just an hour earlier. His shoulders seemed lower. His confidence had disappeared. He stared at the table before finally speaking again. I convinced myself it was necessary, he said quietly. After your parents died, everyone was scared. There were disagreements about money, about responsibility, about the future. I thought I was making the practical choice. Nobody interrupted him. Then, years passed, he continued, and every year it became harder to admit what happened. His voice cracked slightly. Eventually, I stopped trying. The honesty did not erase the past. It could not restore birthdays, holidays, or lost years. Yet for the first time, I believed I was hearing the truth. Across the table, Rebecca wiped tears from her eyes. Several cousins looked devastated. They had spent 20 years believing a version of events that was never fully accurate. In many ways, they had lost something too. Attorney James remained silent, allowing the moment to unfold naturally. That was when he reached for one final folder. "There is one more matter Eleanor wanted addressed," he said. Every eye turned toward him. He opened the folder and removed a handwritten letter. Unlike the others, this one had been sealed until today. James handed it directly to me. "She wanted you to read this yourself." My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the paper. Eleanor's familiar handwriting filled the page. The room disappeared around me as I began reading. She wrote about mistakes, about regret, about the years she spent trying to repair what had been broken. Most of all, she wrote about hope. Hope that one day I would know the truth. Hope that I would not allow bitterness to define my life. Hope that I would understand how deeply she loved me despite everything that happened. Near the end of the letter, one passage stood out above all others. "The greatest inheritance I can leave you is not money. It is the truth, because truth gives people back their lives." Tears blurred the words. For years, I believed my life had been shaped by abandonment. Now I understood it had been shaped by misunderstanding, secrecy, and fear. The difference mattered, more than I could explain. After I finished reading, nobody spoke for several moments. Then I carefully folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. I looked around the room at the family I thought I had lost forever. Some faces carried guilt. Some carried sadness. Some carried relief. None carried the certainty they arrived with. "I cannot change the past," I said quietly. "None of us can." Heads nodded around the table. "But I am tired of living inside a lie." The statement seemed to release something from the room. A burden, a tension, a silence that had lasted far too long. The meeting ended gradually after that. Conversations became quieter, more honest. No dramatic confrontations followed. No grand speeches. Just people trying to understand what had happened and what came next. Later that evening, I visited the cemetery one final time before leaving Cedar Falls. The sun was setting behind the trees. Golden light stretched across the grass. I stood beside Eleanor's grave and placed her letter gently against the headstone for a moment before returning it to my bag. "You kept your promise," I whispered. The wind moved softly through the leaves overhead. Then I turned and walked back toward my car. For the first time in 20 years, I was not carrying questions. I was carrying answers. And as the town slowly disappeared behind me in the rearview mirror, I realized that the secret which shocked an entire family had not been hidden in money, legal documents, or inheritance records. It had been hidden in the truth itself. And finally, after all these years, the truth had found its way home.